The important thing to know about an assassination or an attempted assassination is not who fired the shot, but who paid for the bullet. Eric Ambler, The Mask of Demetrius. On October 29th of this year, a U.S. court convicted two men for targeting an Iranian woman named Masih Alinajad, attempting to kidnap and murder her for the Iranian regime. Masih is a journalist and an activist who has been instrumental in bringing the actions of the Iranian government to public attention, particularly in regards to the status of Iranian women. She is extremely effective, which is exactly why she has been targeted more than once, even though she now lives in the United States. But Masih isn't an unusual case. Throughout history, nations have used assassination as a way to get rid of enemies. It's a fine line to draw. When you're at war, what is assassination and what is battle? The line can be very fine. And if the fate of your nation seems to be at stake, when, if ever, is assassination warranted? The high school civics class question about whether or not you would kill Hitler as a baby or as a young man comes to mind here. The question is less mental exercise than one might think. In 1939, a British military attaché in Berlin offered to kill Hitler with a sniper rifle. The response from the UK Foreign Minister, Lord Halifax, was, "We have not yet reached that stage when we have to use assassination as a substitute for diplomacy." Over 2,000 years ago, the Indian Arthashastra advocated the use of clandestine methods to achieve the objective without waging the battle, usually by assassinating the enemy. It's hard to place state-sponsored assassination as we know it today within a historic framework, simply because for most of the history of human civilization, it's all carried in the Louis XIV quote, "L'État c'est moi." I am the state, or the state is me. I think you get the gist. The one guy is the source of power and authority. Not that it was ever that simple. Two people in one room create politics in every situation. But when a king orders someone killed outside of war, people look a bit less askance at the whole situation than when an impersonal state orders the hit. The murder of the Polish king Przemysl II in 1296 was a clear example of a state-ordered assassination, although it was originally merely a state-sponsored kidnapping that went terribly wrong when the recently crowned king had the audacity to fight back. The various territories that comprised Poland at that time had been fighting with the Margraviate of Brandenburg for a very long time over territory. Przemysl II worked his way through earlier years, and his was the first coronation in Poland in 219 years. This was actually big news. Having a king again paved the way for the unification of Poland, which, of course, was not in the best interest of the Margraves of Brandenburg, the core of what would later become Prussia, who wanted some of that delightful Polish territory for themselves. Przemysl's third wife, Margaret, was the daughter of one of the Margraves, but even that didn't protect him in the end. In fact, it may have hastened things along when the Margraves decided to kidnap the Polish king, and they needed an inside man to help them get the job done. There isn't any evidence of this, however. Then again, it was Margaret's family who liquidated the king. I should make clear here that one of the criteria I really tried to implement in going over historic state-sponsored assassinations was the absence of relation. In other words, I tried to make sure it wasn't a family quarrel. The problem with that is that in an age of kings, Everyone is related. Everyone worth assassinating anyway. Remember, l'état c'est moi. And true to form, even though the Margraviate of Brandenburg was a whole other country whose leaders ordered the targeted assassination of the King of Poland, it wasn't just Przemyśl's wife who was descended from a Margrave herself. There were Polish noble families and one of his nephews involved in the plot as well. Anyway, the kidnap assassins came upon Przemyśl while he was sleeping, but he still fought back hard and was not able to be subdued until he was quite cut up. After riding away with him, the regicidaires realized he would not make it back to Brandenburg as a hostage, and so they tossed him by the side of the road and left. He didn't survive the toss. With Przemyśl's death, the male line of the Greater Poland Piast family was ended, and the unification of Poland was put off for a bit longer, until the 1569 formation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Moving forward a few hundred years, we can actually find a state-sponsored assassination that wasn't the murder of a relative, but it was the favorite counselor of a relative, so it's still sort of family adjacent. On April 24th, 1617, an Italian named Concino Concini was arrested and just so happened to die during the arrest in front of the Louvre, which was still the king's residence at this time. Concini shouted for aid, which the arresting authorities decided constituted resistance, and they proceeded to end him. This was all ordered by the young king Louis XIII, who, along with most of France, blamed Concini and other Italians for the extreme liberties his mother, Marie de' Medici, had taken while acting as regent. Marie rather enjoyed wielding power. To be fair, she was a de' Medici, and one of those de' Medicis. The Medici Bank, the Medici popes, patrons of Michelangelo and Da Vinci, the embodiment of Florence. You shouldn't ask for a lemon if you don't like things bitter. Louis's father had needed money. Marie had money, and her family tendencies were part of the package deal. But the French never accepted the de' Medici queen. For one, she never really learned to speak French fluently. She just never managed to fit in, and likely wasn't all that keen to do so. But she was able to wield tremendous power. And when that power went it all wrong, all of France blamed the Italians. They couldn't kill the queen, so it wasn't yet 1793. So instead, they killed her main administrator and his wife, who was arrested and accused of witchcraft, beheaded, and burned at the stake. They weren't going for half measures at this point. Louis XIII ruled for 33 years that saw the acquisition of overseas colonies and the rise of Cardinal Richelieu. He was also quite Instagram ready. An avid musician, he composed music and even danced ballet. He was also a snazzy dresser who was responsible for that whole century and a half of men in wigs. He only outlived his mother, who continued to scheme for his entire reign, by a couple of months. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, assassinations became far more common than other times in history. Most of them weren't state-sponsored, however. The ideological underpinnings of the vast majority of the killings tended to align with political movements rather than a nation personified. The assassination that kicked off World War I in Sarajevo was a bit of a hybrid. As with most secret schemes, we'll never know the entire truth. We do know, however, that the Russian embassy in Serbia was quite encouraging of the plans put in motion by the Black Hand through their proxies in young Bosnia. They may never have specifically said, "Go shoot the Archduke so we can start a fight," but they were also quite supportive of the sorts of things that would lead to an assassination, and never said, "How about don't assassinate the heir to the Austrian throne?" Adolf Hitler, for all his hate of Russia, emperors, and communists, may have taken a page from the government of the Tsar just after seizing control of the German government. On July 25, 1934, the Chancellor of Austria, a diminutive man named Engelbert Dollfuss, was assassinated by Nazis. Now, to be fair, these were Austrian Nazis. But to be double fair, we've also discovered a few pages from Goebbels' diaries that are pretty clear about what was being planned. On July 22, 1934, the entry read, "Sunday, at the Führer's, Austrian question. Whether it will work? I'm very skeptical." A few days later, he wrote this, "Dollfuss dead, then an honorable retreat by insurgents. Then victory for the government. Lost." I mean, yes, he never actually said, "We sent some Austrian Nazis in to murder an inconvenient head of state," but he also didn't leave a ton of wiggle room for denials. Austria at that time had been on quite a roller coaster since the end of World War I. Article 80 of the Treaty of Versailles had expressly forbidden Anschluss, the joining of Germany and Austria. Although there were quite a few on both sides of those borders in favor of the idea. And in addition to forbidding the formation of a mega German state, the Austrians also lost quite a bit of land, the good land. As a result, everyone was poor, everyone was unhappy, and everyone was looking for solutions. Like many other places, particularly once the Great Depression hit, two rival ideologies began to fight it out: communism and fascism. Now, almost 100 years from the Great Depression ground zero, we take it for granted that communism won out in the Soviet Union and fascism took root in Germany and Italy. The razor's edge of victory has been forgotten. When Hitler became German Chancellor in 1933, he had only become a German citizen the year before. He had renounced his Austrian citizenship in 1925, but he still had plans for his country of birth. Just a few months after being sworn in on January 30th, 1933, the German government made it legal for Austrians to vote in the German elections. The groundwork was laid directly amongst the Austrian people for Anschluss. Engelbert Dollfuss was also a fascist, but not a Nazi. It's a distinction that often gets lost in non-German speaking translations. In fact, he was diametrically opposed to the Nazis as well as the socialists. It meant that he was fighting a political war on two fronts. He was fighting hard, though. When 3 presidents of the National Council resigned, Dollfuss declared Parliament was in crisis and took control using emergency decrees. He banned the Communist Party, and then, after an assassination attempt in November 1933, he declared martial law, bringing back the death penalty for more offenses. In February 1934, it came to a head, and Austria had a little civil war. When I say little, I'm not downplaying what happened. Over 300 people died, an entire neighborhood was shelled, and it took place in several cities. But outside the areas of action, it just wasn't that noticeable. People writing at the time specifically mentioned that it all seemed like business as usual, even in Vienna, where most of the trouble took place. While all this was going on, Dollfuss was also fighting a battle to prevent the very Anschluss that Hitler was trying to bring about. He was the fascist in the way of the fascist German leader's aspirations. And he had an ally in the fascist dictator of Italy, Mussolini. In 1933 and 34, Mussolini still carried some weight against the Germans and was also particularly anti-Anschluss. As another Catholic nation, they were the logical ally in Dollfuss's non-Nazi fascism push. This became known as Austro-fascism. The First Austrian Republic ended, and the federal state of Austria was created using Italy as its template in May 1934. But he was still anti-Anschluss, and Austro-fascism was not Nazi fascism, and it was something Hitler, to absolutely murder the Churchillian quote, up with could not put. And so, historically, we're all sure, despite the Goebbels' diary entries, that less than a month after the Night of the Long Knives, the Nazi government had nothing to do with the Nazis that assassinated the Austro-fascist Engelbert Dollfuss, right? Okay, maybe I believe that Hitler probably did have something to do with the whole thing, even if it was a "will no one rid me of this turbulent priest" moment. But for the purposes of clarity, not everyone thinks so. One of the downfalls of law-based systems is that often there is little desire to plan for the fact that there are those who are comfortable operating outside the laws. It's a fantastic idea to make rules on the world stage outlawing government-sponsored assassinations. But it's much harder to enforce in reality than in theory. Humanity exists not in the black and white, but in the areas of gray. Who amongst us, with 2020 hindsight, does not groan and smack our heads at the statement of Lord Halifax turning down the killing of Hitler? Would that have saved hundreds of millions of lives? On the other hand, are we the sort of society which wants to assassinate inconvenient leaders before they actually become monsters, just in case they might become monsters, because they may not actually become monsters? Not every person we dislike is another Hitler.
What to do